World War I is the first global conflict that was on such a grand scale that it demanded effort from every citizen in each belligerent nation, not just the military. For this reason, it's often referred to as total war or total warfare. Civilians were forced to ration their food while children grew malnourished, and women worked long days in munitions factories where they were exposed to poisonous chemicals that caused terrible health problems like infertility, sickness, and death. The members of society still had to deal with extreme inflation that made the cost of living nearly unbearable for many people. While all of this was happening on the home front, an entire generation of young men was being slaughtered in hordes. Nearly 10 million military deaths and 7 million civilian deaths accounted for a grand total of 16.5 million deaths. Those 16.5 million total deaths average out to 10,530 deaths per day. Another way of looking at it is 3.8 million deaths per year, which is the equivalent of the modern day population of Los Angeles every year for 4 years straight. So how were governments able to convince their populations to sacrifice millions of young men in the trenches, while civilians starved and struggled to survive in towns and cities torn apart by war? In one word, propaganda. We will view propaganda as it is defined in the book Propaganda and Persuasion. Here, the authors define propaganda as the deliberate, systematic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. So, propaganda, by this definition, has existed for millennia. Things like monuments, works of art, plays, scripture, and other mediums, virtually any medium imaginable, has been used by those in power, like governments or rulers, to direct the behavior of their subjects. Sometimes the desired behavior of this propaganda is very subtle. For example, a monarchy might use propaganda to convince its subjects to remain loyal to the crown. The behavior that they are trying to direct is simply loyalty or not revolting. In other instances, the desired behavior and the propaganda is a little bit more heavy-handed. An example of this would be advertisers trying to direct an audience to buy their product. In the case of Europe in 1914, the purpose of most propaganda was to direct the people of each country to support their government and their military while actively fighting against their enemies in any way possible. In the beginning of the war, the German Empire was technologically advanced in almost every way. They had better transportation that allowed their troops to mobilize faster. They had machine guns which fired at a rate that the Entente forces of the British, the Russians, and the French could not handle. They had the largest artillery weaponry available. However, there were a couple of instances where Germany did not have the technological upper hand, and one of these was in propaganda and communication in general. In 1914, Britain had the most advanced knowledge of the effects of communication and propaganda. This might stem from the fact that the politicians and officials in Britain saw firsthand the effect of a subgenre of books called invasion literature. From the Prussian-Franco War of 1871 right up until the beginning of World War I in 1914, invasion literature was perhaps the most popular genre of book in the UK. It was also wildly popular in Germany, France, Russia, and the United States. This literature was basically like doomsday predictions of inevitable invasions by sea and all-out war between Britain and Germany or Britain and France. These fictional books had a very real effect on the population throughout those 50 or so years. By the time 1914 rolled around, there were strong pro-war sentiments all around Britain. It seemed like they had been primed for war by these books. Thanks to this pre-existing knowledge, the British government already had multiple propaganda systems in place before most other nations even understood the effect of these communications. These British systems included a War Propaganda Bureau, a War Aims Committee, and a Central Committee for National Patriotic Associations. So that last group was created 10 days after war was declared, and it was responsible for censorship against dissenters. They were also responsible for organizing lectures and rallies all over the vast British Empire to ensure there was no opposition to the war amongst the king's subjects. So now that we have a little bit of a foundation about the Great War and about what propaganda is, let's dive into some of my favorite examples of propaganda from this time period. We'll start with propaganda from the early years of the war, and as we progress to the later years, you'll see a drastic shift in the style of propaganda, and you'll notice how this shift continues to affect the propaganda of the modern day. So, the first example we'll look at is this poster titled "Once a German, Always a German." So this is a prime example of false atrocity stories. These types of atrocity stories ran rampant during World War One. You could equally blame the media and the government for pushing these lies, these unfounded atrocity stories about Germans bayoneting infants and assassinating nuns and massacring nurses and all of these terrible, terrible war crimes. The media and the government pushed these stories because they knew that such atrocities would strengthen the cause of their own people. It would get more men to enlist. So, here in the top left corner, we see a German soldier bayoneting an infant, murdering a nurse, and burning down a church. And then on the right hand side, there you have the same German. Instead of carrying a knife and a gun, he's carrying a briefcase. And then if you read all that text on the bottom there, it basically describes how the same German who burned down churches and murdered infants will be the same German trying to sell you his pesky German goods after the war is over. So this propaganda works on a couple different levels. First, it makes the people in Britain hate Germans. Of course, it's difficult to like somebody who is murdering infants and killing nurses and all these other war crimes. Again, these stories were not founded. They're mostly just complete outright lies. But then there's another layer to this where it perpetuates the hatred towards the Germans for years to come. So this propaganda is looking at life after the war, and it's basically saying you are not a good citizen if after this war is through, you continue to conduct business with any German, because any German could have been the one committing these atrocities. Therefore, they are all guilty, even in a post-war civilized relationship. So this kind of propaganda, while it served its purpose, bringing in lots of men to enlist in the military, and really drumming up support for the government and the military, would eventually come back to haunt Britain. Later on, when these countries would negotiate a peace, it would be difficult for the British people to understand how they could willingly negotiate peace with people who they have been told are the most terrible evil the world has ever seen. So here's another poster. Once again, it depicts a story that seems unfounded. It seems like it never happened, although it's much less atrocious and violent than the previous poster. Here, I want to call your attention to the word Hun. So, Hun is a strange word to call the Germans. There is no genetic, racial, or cultural lineage that connects the German Empire to the Huns. However, in the minds of a Westerner at this time, the word Hun would immediately call to mind a barbaric savage who would tear you limb from limb and rape all of your women and burn down entire villages. So, just by kind of mentioning the German and the Hun in the same sentence, by associating Germans with Huns, it automatically, in the minds of the audience, directs their behavior to make them think of Germans as basically subhuman, savage, animalistic, barbaric. Even though these Germans were only a few hundred miles away from the British and the French, and always had been, suddenly that geographic proximity means nothing. Those Germans are barely human, We are sophisticated Europeans fighting for liberty and democracy, etc. So between these two posters and many, many others, and all of these rallies and censorship, the British government was able to enlist more than 2 million men in the first year of the conflict. That is a great example of how this propaganda directed a desired behavior. So, in this case, the propagandist is the British government. The desired behavior is enlisting into the military or supporting the military in this war. And you can see it is an overwhelming success. So, as you will probably know, the United States came into the war pretty late. However, they still had their own propaganda going on before the war and, of course, during. We will look at some of the propaganda before the United States gets involved, and then we will look at the propaganda from the moment that it declares war. And you will see this dramatic shift. When America joins the war, the propaganda changes, and this is when we start to see the type of propaganda that continues to exist today, over 100 years later. Okay, so first, this piece from before America joined the war. It is an editorial cartoon called 10 Little Hyphens, and it was published in the New York Evening Standard in 1915, about 2 years before America joins. Now, the term hyphen is a derogatory term for anybody who is multi-ethnic in America. Irish American, Irish hyphen American, Chinese hyphen American. At this time, German Americans were the second largest ethnic group in the States, making up 9% of the population. The only ethnic group that is larger than the Germans is the black population in America, which makes up about 10%. So one similarity this piece has to the British propaganda we looked at earlier is the amount of words. A recurring theme in these three pieces of propaganda is that in order to understand the message, you have to read the words. It would be difficult to just look at the image and understand what the propagandist is trying to tell you. In this example, you would need to read each line of this offensive little poem and all the words that depict these despicable crimes these dirty little hyphens are committing, like spying and conniving and bombing and cheering for the fatherland. So while this message was certainly effective, it is limited because it requires enough time to read the 10 lines of words and look at all of the images. It also requires that you A, know how to read, and B, know how to read in English. So if you are somebody that knows how to read and knows how to read English and you have the time to read these lines, even with all of that, the chance of you remembering this whole message is slim. You might remember the general gist of the message, but even that might get lost in all of the other little details. We'll move on to the next piece here. Okay, so here we have a very effective poster. This is what I would say is the defining poster of what propaganda would turn into. First, let's look at the main difference between this one and the earlier pieces we looked at. You'll notice it only has one word, and that word is enlist. So even if, ignoring the image for the moment, even if you only see that one word, it's an easy word to remember, enlist. It's very clear who it's talking to, young men of military age. And it's very clear what it wants you to do. It wants you to enlist in the military. You don't even really need to be literate. You probably know what that word means in 1917. It's been used so much, it's become such a popular word in the culture because of everything that's going on, that everybody knows what that word enlist means. Even people who don't speak English will almost certainly know the word enlist if they are living in America. So beyond that, let's look at the image. This is the key point here. Propaganda changes from being text-based to image-based, and it becomes much more powerful. So here we have an image of a woman holding an infant sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Now the audience viewing this poster will have recently learned about the sinking of the Lusitania, a ship which was shot down by a German U-boat where 128 Americans died and many, many more British and Irish civilians died. But everybody in America knows this story, and everybody is outraged about the deaths of these innocent Americans. So, an image of a woman with a baby sinking to the bottom of the ocean right after the sinking of the Lusitania will make the audience recall this event that makes them feel so much anger and maybe even hatred towards the Germans. This image is not even putting forth a new message. This image is meant to make you recall an event that you already know about, the sinking of the Lusitania, and it's meant to make you recall those negative emotions. And while doing that, it attaches on a new message to your anger and to your recollection of the event, the word enlist. So now the idea of enlisting in the military and the anger towards the dead Americans from the sinking of Lusitania are linked together. This is very, very powerful and an interesting way to combine emotion into the propaganda to direct the desired behavior of getting young Americans to join the military. Now, this entire poster is emotionally powerful, concise in its messaging. That means that, as we mentioned earlier, even people who don't speak English that well will understand this message and will be able to join the military. Beyond that, in a world where technological advances are causing everything to speed up through automobiles, trains, things of this nature, someone riding past this poster who only has a second to look at it can see it, grasp that message, and remember it, recall it, and tell it to their friends and other people they may meet. This is a very powerful poster because it plays on emotions that almost every American already feels. It recalls an event that every American will already know about. It attaches a powerful message to this recollection, and it is extremely easily digested and remembered. Anybody who sees this poster is going to understand exactly what the desired behavior of the propagandist is. And that desired behavior is, of course, enlist in the US military. Okay, this video went way over. I'll be continuing in a second one later on where we'll cover some more of the propaganda focusing on the United States and how it affected propaganda for the next 100 years, including advertising and the type of stuff you see every single day. This is my first video that I've ever made, so thanks for watching if you did. And they will get better with time, I promise.